South Korea. K-pop, K-dramas, fashion, and K-food. Over the past decade, Korean pop culture has become the icon of modern style. With such a fanatic audience for all things Korea, it's surprising that one form of media remains in obscurity even in its home country. In today's video, we shine a light on a hidden industry, tracing its roots from the birth of a nation through troubled adolescence and into the modern era. This is a brief history of South Korean animation. In Korean, there's a saying, 고래 싸움에 새우등 터진다. When whales fight, it's the shrimp whose back is broken. For the first half of the 20th century, Korea was nothing if not a small fry surrounded by giants. The Joseon dynasty lasted 505 years, from 1392 to 1897. The cultural and technological achievements which defined its early society had slowly devolved into excessive bureaucracy and isolationism. After witnessing the once mighty China become divided by international powers, it was an understandable reaction. Their neighbor Japan, after their own defeat by the West, had rebuilt themselves in the image of their aggressors, both in technology and desire for expansion. After a series of short wars, the nation now known as the Korean Empire was taken over by the Japanese war machine. In an effort to assimilate the country, Japan over 35 years reduced Koreans to second-class citizens, banned the use of the Korean language, and systematically erased their native culture. So, while the rest of the world were taking their first steps in experimenting and developing animation as an art form, under total censorship, the Korean people were forced to fuel the Japanese army with soldiers, food, and women. The defeat of Japan in 1945 was expected to have freed Korea from subjugation, yet their troubles were far from over. The bombing of Hiroshima, which also killed an estimated 30,000 Korean soldiers, signified the end of the Second World War. Russia and the US were tasked with the administration of the now liberated peninsula. As neither wanted to lose such a strategic location, yet could not afford another war, particularly with nuclear weapons, they were left at an ideological stalemate. It was the beginning of the Cold War, the Soviets versus the US, North versus South. In 1950, the same year as Disney's Cinderella, Russia and America agreed to remove their forces from Korean land. Immediately, war broke out. Over the next 3 years, tit-for-tat battles resulted in the death of 3 million Korean people. Both sides agreed to an armistice and a return to the original border established before the war. The Korean War has never officially ended, but it was here, after half a century of exploitation, death, and censorship, that Korean animation began. Widely accepted as the first South Korean animation, the 1956 commercial for Lucky Toothpaste was reflective of the country and government at the time, an ancient society coming to grips with modernity. As is exemplifying of Korean progress, the industry developed quickly, with Shin Dong-hun's series of soju commercials. The 1959 public education cartoon, Let's Catch Rats, reminded us that despite progress, the country was still plagued by third world problems. Continued skirmishes against North Korean guerrilla armies, and constrained by a corrupt government ill-equipped to clear up these complications, Korean citizens were in need of a change. On the morning of May 16, 1961, tanks rolled into Seoul, and a surprise military coup overthrew the government. Their leader, General Park Jong-hee, trained by the Japanese military and a reformed communist, he was a man of contradictory allegiances. Though one thing was for certain, either by carrot or stick, he was determined to push Korea into the modern era. Ironically, 1961 saw the release of the propaganda short educating the importance of voting, something that would have no real effect until several decades later. Instead, more practical advice could be taken from the fable of the grasshopper and the ant. Under a new dictator government, it was not the time to play. President Park enacted a series of 5-year plans, the first being focused on 6 industries: cement, synthetic fiber, electricity, fertilizer, iron, and oil. This would eliminate domestic import costs and expedite national rebuilding. Most animations of the time were government propaganda promoting their ideology. A Way to Live Well shows a variety of animation styles and encourages Koreans to work hard for the betterment of their country. The 1964 short, Let's Not Be Fooled Again, educates the public on the evils of communism and their wish to dismantle Korean society. The first 5-year plan was an immense success. Despite having their rights extremely limited, the economy grew exponentially. Based on the Korean folktale and popular comic strip, in 1967, South Korea's first feature-length animation, Dong, was released. Directed by Shin Dong-hun of Soju commercial fame, the film sold 200,000 tickets in the first 2 weeks, becoming the #2 movie of the year. Compared to Western animation at the time, it might seem low quality. But considering that it was made on a makeshift camera, the film is impressive given the conditions. But more importantly, it was the first animation boom in Korea. Over the next few years, animated features were being released consistently. Prince Hodong and Princess Nakrang retold the ancient Korean love story. Stop-motion puppetry also had a fantastic foray into film, with the unintentionally funny Hungbul and Norbul. The 1968 action films Golden Iron Man as well as some WooKong were both released in Japan. Though the low-quality animations and weak scripts received harsh criticism from the Japanese audiences. Consecutive releases saw diminishing profits, and after the cinematic flop of animations from 1971, such as Lightning Atom, the boom was over. For 5 years, the domestic industry dried up entirely. Live-action films also found it increasingly difficult to produce movies at a rate required to maintain their licenses, and thus resorted to fake co-productions. The Hong Kong film, A Monk Goes East, saw a Korean studio haphazardly replace close-up footage of the main character with a Korean actor. It was technically illegal, but for a period of time, common practice. The animation industry had a much simpler task, redubbing and changing the credits of Japanese animations and claiming them as their own. This obviously created a lot of confusion as to which animations of the era were actually Korean. Although there was an official ban on Japanese pop culture, children's programming was the unique exception to the rule. In 1975, the Japanese anime Mazinger Z was an instant hit and launched a golden age of Korean animation. The most beloved of all is the robot Taekwon-bi, in which a young boy pilots a giant robot to defeat the army of a mad scientist. Despite being a clear copy of Mazinger Z, the franchise is iconic in South Korea, seeing 7 films as well as a TV show. Stolen characters and storylines were rampant. Super Metal Solar 123 confidently combined various anime characters and designs. Not only borrowing from Japanese cartoons, 2 unlicensed DC superheroes saw Korean debuts, with the yellow-suited Batman and the 1978 Galactic Wonder Princess clearly plagiarizing Wonder Woman. Propaganda films too continued to be made, such as 1978's anti-communist film General Toli and the Group 77 Secret. As with the previous boom, quality and profits quickly declined. Despite criticism, the success and prosperity of the sci-fi genre is demonstrative of the Korean desire to move towards a brighter future, and their increasing disillusionment with the dictator government. Labor movements and civil unrest began to reach a boiling point. The Korean people demanded their freedom. In 1979, as protests were being quelled in Busan, President Park scolded the Central Intelligence Director for not suppressing the protests brutally enough, allegedly stating, if necessary, he would have killed 30,000 protesters. The director left the room for a short while, and upon his return, shot the president. The memory of Park Chung-hee is complicated. On the one hand, he led Korea along a path of unprecedented growth, with policies that have continued long after his assassination. On the other, it was a brutal and corrupt dictatorship that ignored basic human rights. In his 18 years of rule, the foundations he laid took South Korea from a third world country into an economic powerhouse. But following his death, the Korean people were finally ready to choose their own destiny. Or so they thought. In 1980, just weeks after the president's assassination, the democratic dreams of Korean citizens were near instantly destroyed when John Doo-hwan used his military alliances to appoint himself the new leader of the country. Those brief seconds of freedom were enough to ignite protests throughout the nation. The new president imposed full martial law and sent in armed forces to quiet any opposition. Gwangju in the south felt the full force of Chun's authority. John's army descended on pro-democracy demonstrators, and over the course of 9 days, an estimated 2,000 Koreans were slaughtered. It is remembered as the Gwangju Uprising. The new government attempted to cover up the event, claiming it was a surprise attack by North Korea, or that they were fighting communist rebellions. Objectors to the presidency were sent to purification camps. Among the 30,000 detainees were journalists, teachers, students, and civil servants. To date, Chun Doo-hwan remains the most despised Korean president. The sci-fi boom of the 1970s was also effectively squashed under the president's child protection policy, in which he called sci-fi a meaningless, empty illusion. The final sci-fi animations saw a marked increase in quality, but were powerless against heavy-handed censorship. Amid near daily student protests and tear gas-scented streets, South Korea was selected to host the 1988 Summer Olympics. It was a chance for Korea to enter the international stage and let the world bear witness to their struggles for economic success. The new 5-year plan saw a shift away from heavy industry and towards electronics. The average annual income had grown from $300 in 1970 to $6,000 by 1989. As a result, TV ownership skyrocketed from 6% of the population to 90% during the same period. Animation had a new, larger audience. And in the lead-up to the Olympic Games, the majority of cartoons were sports-themed. 1983's Arm of Gold was one of multiple baseball-centric stories, such as the Dokutak trilogy as another notable example. But the standout animation of the era was Run Honey. Featuring a young teen whose mother had passed away and father works abroad, she focuses her pent-up sadness and rage to become a competitive runner. Despite their success, Korea had now become fully open to imported media from abroad. Producers and distributors found it much cheaper and more efficient to import shows from Japan and America rather than fund Korean works. As foreign movie studios opened Korean offices in Seoul, fear of a dying film and TV industry brought hundreds of filmmakers, stars, and students to the streets in protests. During the screening of American films Fatal Attraction and the sci-fi comedy Batteries Not Included, protesters released snakes down the aisles to show support for their movement. Elsewhere, domestic and international pressures demanded that President John step down before the Olympic Games were held. Fearing his life, he obliged. Despite the haunting ghosts of the past, it was a genuine time of celebration throughout the country. They had been lifted from poverty into an emerging democratic international player in just 37 years. Perhaps ignoring the sacrifice, it was labeled an economic miracle, and future growth was all but guaranteed. For the animation industry, however, success came in the most awkward of ways. The energy of South Korea in the 1990s was palpable. Experiencing political and social freedom for the first time, pop culture and counterculture of young Koreans exploded onto the scene. HOT and other Korean idol groups like Pinkle, in brightly colored matching outfits, choreographed dancing, and catchy lyrics, caused the youth of Koreans to lose their minds. Jexkiss's school anthem criticized the education system in a joyous rebellion against traditions. While it might seem tame by Western standards, it was something that previous generations could only dream of doing. In cinema, the admittedly clumsy yet high-octane spy film, Shitty, saw North Korean sleeper agents detonating bombs in Seoul. The titular character was not only the enemy, also a sympathetic romantic lead. The movie broke box office records, selling 6.5 million tickets, beating out Titanic for the #1 position in Korea. Animation 2 attempted to push the barrier with the first adult-only cartoons. Noodle Nude was a collection of short sketches that desperately sought to find the line of good taste. And Blue Seagull combined traditional and 3D animation to tell the story of a man fighting against the Yakuza and US Mafia to retrieve a royal sword. Both crude in style and in context, they were milestones nonetheless. Elsewhere, with the introduction of Tooniverse, a TV channel dedicated to cartoons, captivated new young audiences. Hungry Beast 5, based on a comic and eerily similar to the Japanese series Slam Dunk, gained a large following in its own right. Soul Frame Lysenko saw a return to the sci-fi days of old, but with noticeable improvements to the story and quality, as did The Steel Force in 1999, which was touted by the filmmakers as the world's second fully 3D animated feature film after Toy Story. There were a number of classic cartoons produced during this time. Black Rubber Shoes, proudly described by its fans as Korean Simpsons, it gave a nostalgic, yet not always rosy look into the life of Korea's 1960s. The government discovered that animation accounted for 98% or 49 billion won of all media exported in 1995. Many Korean animations were popular at home, but they didn't earn anywhere near that much abroad. The profits were coming from somewhere else. It came from OEM, Original Equipment Manufacturing, aka outsourcing. Animation is a labor-intensive job. Each second of film classically requires 12 to 24 frames to be drawn. As a way to keep production costs down, developed nations outsourced the less important tasks of filling in keyframes to countries that had cheaper labor costs. Outsourcing work in Korea began as early as the 1960s, with Japanese series like Ogon Bato, as well as colorizing old Hanna-Barbera cartoons in the 1970s. By the 80s, Korean animators had proven themselves to be able to take on more complex projects. The most prominent example of this system is Nelson Shin and his company, Akum Studios. Born in 1939, Nelson was an assistant on Hong Gil-dong before eventually moving to the US, where he worked on animated films such as Fritz the Cat, famously animated the lightsabers in Star Wars, and was the director and producer of the Transformers movie. After starting his own studio in Korea, his relationship with Marvel, Hasbro, and Warner Brothers generated lucrative outsourcing work. By the 90s, dedicated American cartoon channels were producing shows at an unprecedented rate. Nelson and the other Korean studios were the ones to take on the tasks. Everything from The Simpsons and Spider-Man to My Little Pony and Arthur, almost every popular cartoon of the era was animated in part by Korean hands. Ironically, despite being profitable and busier than ever, it was crippling the domestic animation industry. As many as 90% of all animation shown on Korean TV were imported. South Korean animators were unintentionally helping their competition beat them on their home turf. At the same time, the Asian economic crisis of 1997 sent shockwaves throughout the world. The Korean government was forced to take a $57 billion loan from the International Monetary Fund. Collectively called the IMF period, the Korean economy experienced its first real decline. A KBS TV campaign encouraged tens of thousands of Koreans to come together, donate their gold and jewelry, which added up to $2.2 billion and destabilized international gold prices. The loan was able to be paid back 3 years early. But now, for Korean producers, the idea of investing in Korean animations was a risk not worth taking. So by the end of the millennium, Korea was the world's leading animation supplier that produced few original works. Being so overly reliant on outsourcing would prove to be unwise, as new competition started to emerge. Over the course of 40 years, South Korea had gone from a third world nation to a leading technological innovator. By 2001, 50% of the population were connected to the internet. With wider access to new technology came new types of media. Flash animation. Though not as complex as traditional animation, it became popular thanks to its small file sizes and relative ease of production. Mashimaru was one of the first marketable animations to emerge. He was crass, violent, and awarded Cartoon of the Year in 2002, and spawned masses of merchandise, games, and eventually a Chinese TV show. Jolaman, despite his basic design, was also aimed at an older audience, and was equally profitable in Korea. Their success was quickly followed by other online series, such as Puka and Jae-dong's Family, which was the first to transition to traditional TV distribution. At the same time, however, the rise of new economies with larger, cheaper workforces caused offshore outsourcing work to rapidly decline in South Korea. Profits dropped from $167 million in 2000 to just $62 million in 2004. Domestically produced animations such as Bast of Lemon, a futuristic sci-fi series where players battle through VR, and Oseam, an award-winning movie about a brother and sister seeking refuge in a temple, were able to gain a small audience abroad, but they were not enough to sustain an industry. With Korean companies reluctant to fully commit financially, a new mode of creation was sought. Enter co-production. An incentive system where studios from different nations could work together to produce a single product and share both risk and reward. Working with Aardman Animation, Vu's character system produced the bright and bubbly Canimals to much success. Doya Jibang, a detective series that features a pig dog with rabbit ears, was created with Chinese studios. Korean and Japanese co-production resulted in a large variety of shows, such as the Digimon-esque Mixmaster, the card battler Tai Chi Chasers, as well as the slightly educational Elemental Hunters. In a show of mutual friendship, North and South Korea even worked together to create their own animated feature film, though the real money came from South Korea's character boom. Compared to the US and Japan, which already created a huge number of character mascots, Korea still lacked its own internationally known icon. Korea's first standout character was Dooley the Little Dinosaur. Debuting in 1983 in the comic book Treasure Island, Dooley was first given a TV show in 1987, and later an animated film in 1996. Since then, he has starred in multiple movies, modern reboots, and a slew of video games and theme parks. Despite being beloved at home, he and other Korean characters were largely unknown abroad. The first real breakout Korean character appeared in 2003, in the form of Pororo, the Little Penguin. Aimed at kindergartners, the series has had many spin-offs, licensing deals, and become hugely popular abroad. Because of the success of Pororo and the relative ease of mass-producing 3D animations, South Korean studios pumped out their own attempts in rapid succession. Dilbo the Gift Dragon, Kokomon, and Vroomies, among many others, were created with varying degrees of success. Each with their own line of toys and licensing deals, the character boom was a point of pride for the government, yet received strong criticisms for being odorless, lacking anything reflective of Korean culture or design, and because it was targeted at such young children, there was little brand loyalty. In 2013, Korea elected their first female president. Park Geun-hye was the daughter of dictator president Park Chung-hee, and she too set out her own 5-year plan to push Korea towards a creative economy. And considering what was starting to happen abroad, it was a good plan. For most in the West, Korean culture remained unknown until around 2009, with the first modern K-pop hit in the US, Nobody, by the Wonder Girls, followed quickly by G from Girls' Generation, and of course the unexpected mega hit, Gangnam Style, by Psy. It all seemed to have come out of nowhere, but its international breakout was an inevitability. Hallyu, literally the Korean tide or Korean wave, had been growing in popularity for over a decade. What the West was experiencing was the Korean Wave 2.0. The success of Korean media can be traced back as far as 1992, with What is Love, a TV drama series which gained a large following in Hong Kong and the Chinese mainland. Winter Sonata, another Korean drama series, became so popular that it received an animated spin-off, as did The Great Jungkook. Classic Korean cinema like the sci-fi flick The Host, directed by Academy Award winner Bong Joon-ho, and Park Chan-wook's Bloody Vengeance trilogy, Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, Lady Vengeance, and the acclaimed Oldboy, helped bring the spotlight further in South Korea's direction. By 2007, thanks to social media and video streaming services, the second Korean wave began to surge. My Love from the Stars was a trend-setting romantic drama that popularized Korean fried chicken in many countries in the world. In the music world, artists and idol groups slowly began taking over online music charts. The girl group Kara created their own animated album tie-in to celebrate their own success. Creator of the new 5-year plan to increase Korea's creative economy, President Park Geun-hye was impeached and sentenced to prison for 20 years due to bribery and leaking government secrets. But the government remained fully committed to boosting Koreans' cultural production. Today, we have officially entered Hallyu 3.0, with Korean media becoming mainstream. Supergroups like BTS and Blackpink routinely break music records, and Korean dramas bring in shockingly large audiences each year. Korean cinema too continues to gain more widespread prestige, and yet South Korean animation still remains in obscurity. Although largely unknown, modern Korean animations have some truly standout titles. 2016's children's show, Haunted House, has received multiple movies, and the disturbing 2011 King of Pigs, as well as the 2017 Senior Class, show a greater trend to cover more adult themes. However, the industry continues to be plagued by issues of decades prior. Odorless children's programming, despite profitability, lack any Korean identity and fail to promote the industry as a whole. Media tie-ins do little to shine in their own rights and are largely hit or miss in quality due to being a cash grab in nature. Perhaps the biggest issue is that despite the number of quality animations being made, investors lack the confidence to promote effectively. Elsewhere in the world, newly developed economies with their own studios are beginning to take the spotlight for themselves, which all but ensures that Korean animation will remain unknown abroad and even to Korean people themselves. But perhaps not all hope is lost. Over 75 plus years, South Korean animation has been intrinsically linked to the highs and lows of South Korean society, the struggles under absolute control, an embrace of national pride, and attempts to take a run at the world stage. As Korean media has increasingly become the norm internationally, somewhere along the way, the animation industry got left behind. In the future, as the hype of Korea's third wave begins to die down, I believe that in the hands of a talented few, Korean animation might just be the catalyst that starts Hallyu 4.0, and finally give South Korean animation a chance to stand in the spotlight. So thank you for watching another one of my videos. This video took even longer to make than the last one, but thank you for your patience, and if you like this video, please let me know in the comments. I'd like to do more of this style in the future and, get better at doing this style, so your comment would be really appreciated. But as always, thank you so much for watching. I'm WooKong, and goodbye.